On today's video, we're going to be learning about the 2 million Cubans that live in the United States. By the early 1500s, the Spaniards had started to arrive in Florida. Cubans are descendants of Spaniards crossed with Taino or other native Caribbean Native Americans. Cubans' first presence in the United States was in Southwest Florida, where Cuban fishermen were inhabiting what was once the capital city of the Calusa Native American tribe. Located in the heart of Estero Bay in what is today the Fort Myers metropolitan area, this mound key was an elevated shell mound that was the capital city of the Calusa Empire in Southwest Florida. These shell mounds and other coastal communities were used as fishing ranches by Cuban fishermen as early as the 1700s. Cuban fishermen and Native American tribes also had ranches for fishing in what is today the area of Tampa, Florida. Cubans were present in South Florida before the American period. In what is currently the Hyde Park neighborhood of Tampa, Cubans had fishing camps predating any American or English settlement. By the 1820s, this area had become part of the United States. However, the Englishmen refused to move to Florida because of its weather inclements, mosquito-filled swamps, and of course the unbearable heat and humidity, which meant that despite Florida no longer being under Spanish control, no American or English presence was established in Florida along coastal fishing communities, and the Cubans continued their fishing endeavors in the area despite the region now belonging to the Americans. During the American Civil War, Cubans were taking part both in Union and in Confederate armies. Cuban fishermen were able to bypass Union blockades and bring much-needed supplies to the Confederate South, in particular areas along Florida, Georgia, and Alabama, quite literally preventing people from starving to death. While there were efforts to produce sugar like the Yulee Sugar Mill that is in Homosassa, Florida, and a plantation in what is now Ellenton, Florida, known as the Gamble Mansion, a large percentage of the sugar and molasses and other supplies that were desperately needed in the South during the Civil War undoubtedly were coming from Cuba. And with high-ranking Cubans on both sides of the Civil War, it seems like they played benefits instead of picking sides, with Cubans in northern states working for the Union and anybody in the southern region of the country taking sides of the Confederacy. We should also understand that the term Cuban was almost interchangeable with Puerto Ricans, since at that time the Spanish heritage was of much more importance than the nationality, and there exists confusion between who was Cuban and Puerto Rican during the American Civil War. After the Civil War, Cubans were still active in Southwest Florida. By the 1870s, cattle had been started to be shipped from Arcadia, what is DeSoto County, into Cuba out of Punta Rasa, which is near current-day Fort Myers. The early Florida cowboy depended on this trade partnership with Cuba to ensure that their cattle would find market. So for the most part of the late 1800s, the Southwest Florida cowboy had more in common with their trade partners in the Caribbean islands like Cuba than they would have with the rest of the United States. Much of the wealth and early fortunes of the hardy Southwest Florida cowboy were undoubtedly tied to Cuban money. Undoubtedly, we're talking about Spanish gold. And it wasn't until the 1870s that the Spanish flag was removed from Cuban territory and what would soon become the Cuban flag would start to take form. For a brief period leading till 1902, the flag of the United States was flown in Cuba until the Treaty of Paris. And it almost seemed that with the efforts of Americans in the Spanish-American War to remove Spanish influence from the North American continent, that Cuba could at some point have become part of the United States as an effort to completely eliminate the Spanish rule from North America. However, in 1902, Cuba became an independent country, and despite many Americans wanting Cuba to be part of the United States and many Cubans wanting to be Americans, the United States did not want to become an empire like the English and the Spanish, and they helped countries become independent more than join the United States. However, it was a very close call between Cuba being its own independent country and being another state for the United States. By this time period, Cubans' presence in the Tampa area had grown from just fishing ranches along the coast to actually incorporating into cities like Tampa, where Cubans, alongside with a large Italian community, had grown in agriculture and other business endeavors to create what is now the city of Tampa. The Ybor City District within the city of Tampa today has many historical businesses alongside historical markers that denote the Cuban presence in the early founding stages of the city of Tampa and vicinity. By the 1960s, Cuba had changed completely, with Fidel Castro taking over. A massive exodus of wealthy Cubans left for the state of Florida. Names like Bacardi, Prio Socarrás, the last democratically elected president of Cuba, are now resting in grave sites that can be found in Miami's Little Havana community. And symbolically, this is the gravesite also of democracy in the country of Cuba. The name Socarrás can also be found in Tampa's Ybor City. I'm not sure if there's a relationship between those two last names, but both businesses in Tampa's Ybor City and Cuba's last democratically elected president both carry the last name Socarrás. Cuba's iconic patriotic hero Jose Marti was also commonly found in the Tampa area. Jose Marti Park in Tampa, Florida, which is near Ybor City, is said to belong to Cuba. Rather of symbolic importance, whether legal or not, it is believed that a small section of that park belongs to Cuba. So we can see that a predominantly large history of Florida was influenced by Cubans. Today, as the exodus from Cuba continues that started in the 1960s, there are now close to 2 million Cubans and their descendants living within the United States. A special privilege granted by the United States to Cubans that has never been extended to any other nationality allow Cubans to simply step foot in the United States and have the avenue for legal process to become an American citizen. These Cubans vastly voted Republican. Obama, in his last day in office, removed the dry foot, wet foot law, which allowed Cubans to become U.S. citizens through permanent resident status simply by stepping foot in the United States. It is believed that the recent Barack Obama decided to take away the wet foot, dry foot law and stop Cubans from having legal entry into the United States is because they were mostly voting for Republican governments. So roughly from the termination of Barack Obama's office moving forward, Cubans that have come to the United States, in particular the state of Florida being the closest, have not been allowed to go through the simple U.S. process to become citizens like they were before. Since that day moving forward, Cubans entering the United States became predominantly undocumented. In the last few years, Cuba has erupted into civil violence, prompting as much as 200,000 Cubans to enter the United States just within the last year. These and other immigration changes in the United States have started to wear away at Cubans' loyalty to the Republican Party, and now many Cubans, especially those who are more recent arrivals or born in the United States, are starting to be 50-50 split between Republican and Democrats. The long-held loyalty that the Cuban community in the United States had to this particular political party is no longer as relevant as it was in the past. Cubans have always held a strong political power in the state of Florida, which has even been said to influence national presidential elections. Currently, Florida is not the only place in the United States that has a significant Cuban population. West New York, Hoboken, Union City, areas in northern New Jersey, right outside of New York City, have had a huge Cuban American community. Los Angeles, California, Las Vegas, Nevada, Louisville, Kentucky, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Georgia, and of course, the entire state of Florida. In the 70s and 80s, Hispanic communities were known to have a lot of crime problems. However, today, the cities that have the largest Hispanic communities, places like Southern Texas, Miami, New Jersey, and all of the other areas that have large Hispanic communities, whether Cuban or of other Hispanic nationality, large cities like El Paso that have large Hispanic communities are now considered the safest places in the United States by murder rate. If you were to look at the safest cities in the United States of considerable population, San Jose, California, El Paso, Texas, Miami, Florida, Hialeah, Florida, you'll notice that all of the safest cities in the United States are today predominantly of Hispanic population. While the media wants to portray these Hispanic communities as vicious criminals with movies like Scarface, the reality is that Hispanic American cities are now by far the safest places to live in the United States with the lowest murder rates. While in many American cities, the Hispanic communities are sometimes the poorest part of the city, when a city becomes majority Hispanic, like El Paso, Texas, Miami, Florida, Hialeah, Florida, you can expect that their crime rate will be among the lowest in the entire country. As addiction and violence grips large cities in the United States, majority Hispanic cities have been able to keep their cities safe and free of this violent culture that is gripping the United States. Many people looking to live in safer communities are now moving to places like Miami, despite the fact it's a majority Hispanic city, while there's no real explanation why places like Hialeah and El Paso, Texas, which are predominantly Hispanic areas, have a far lower murder rate. I have come to assume that there's two contributing factors. One is gun culture, which is not as prevalent in Hispanic communities as it is in other communities in the United States. The other is analytically easy to prove, the fact that Hispanics have a far lower percentage of drug use and overdose death rates than any other race. Many people also claim that first-generation immigrants want the absolute best for their children because they come from troubled countries. Failure is simply not an option for parents. They demand the absolute best for their children, being that they're first-generation Americans, and they expect them to take advantage of all the benefits living in the United States offers. However, despite these communities being the safest places to live analytically in the United States, the media has also perpetrated a propaganda campaign to make cities like San Jose, El Paso, and Miami be labeled as dangerous places to live. Today, the economical deprivation that has prevailed in the Latin American countries has caused Latin America to become the poorest region in the world, the most violent region in the world. After the Civil War, migration from Africa to the United States continued to be very significant. Many African Americans assume that they are descendants from slaves. However, immigrant migration from Africa to the United States was massive even after the Civil War. There was significant African migration to the United States after the Civil War, which would conclude that a vast percentage of African Americans are really not descendants from slaves, but from people who migrated from Africa to North America after the Civil War. But despite the United States being founded by immigrants, they're now turning on the new wave of immigrants coming to the United States. Europe, Asia, and Africa are no longer coming to North America, but there's enough problems within North America that people are fleeing to the United States. Over the last 50 years, migration from Latin America to the United States has increased at incredible rates, far surpassing the influx of immigrants that came from Europe. And today, Cubans no longer hold this special privilege of being allowed to come to the United States and become U.S. citizens with very little hurdles. Today, Cubans are just another bunch among the many immigrants that are coming to the United States in a time period where no legal status is given to those trying to enter the country. But despite there being no legal avenues to enter the United States and remain permanently legally, the children of Cuba and of many countries throughout the entire world dream to one day come to the United States. Do they know the real sentiment that Americans have for them? At what point did the person trying to live the American dream become the illegal villain? In 2024, coins commemorating African women will be entering circulation in the United States, and it is believed that Celia Cruz, a Cuban salsa singer, will be one of the women featured in these U.S. coins. While a lot of people are taking it for granted, I'll believe it when I see it. And it's interesting that for the first stage in American history, Afro-Cubans have broken their alliance to the communist regime and have started to come to the United States in unprecedented numbers. It's definitely interesting that the face of an Afro-Cuban will be on U.S. currency, despite the fact if Afro-Cubans wanted to come to the United States, they wouldn't legally be allowed to do so. It's as ironic as what's happening in inner cities in the United States, where African American communities are displaced by gentrification, and then on the buildings that are displacing the communities, they paint African American people as if to say, you were here before in person, now you're here in a mural. Many Cubans in the United States simply do not reflect what Cubans back in Cuba actually are. Cuba having a large African influence and Cubans coming to the United States appearing to be mostly white. Interestingly enough, many Cubans that are in the United States now and claim to be die-hard Republicans were just a few years ago in Cuba taking part in the communist government, came to the United States, and now they all of a sudden happen to be die-hard Republicans, despite the fact that when they were in Cuba, they were part of the Communist Party. Avid supporters at that. A lot of people are catching on that these new Cuban arrivals are complete flip-flop sellouts. In previous decades, when Cubans arrived here, a lot of them were really political exiles. Many of them were political prisoners. They were incarcerated in Cuba for standing up against the regime, and that is why the United States gave these people legal shelter, because they really were being persecuted by the Cuban government. However, more recently, it's become difficult for people to have some type of sentiment for the Cubans who immediately after arriving in the United States forget that they were communists and now happen to be die-hard Republicans. On top of that, they paid a criminal organization to bring them to the United States in what's known as a speedboat. These aren't political exiles, refugees, or political prisoners. These are people who paid a criminal organization to bring them here in a fast boat. When the state of Colorado made legalization there, tens of thousands of Cubans moved to Colorado because they were already engaging in the illegal cultivation business. These Cubans leaving Florida was a huge benefit for the Cuban community in the state, as these were linked to criminal syndicates that thankfully left Florida and went to Colorado. And today, Cubans aren't looked at respectably like they were many decades ago. People understand they're kind of sellouts catering to their economical benefits, almost looked at, well, as a woman who sells her body, willing to give a little bit of gratification in exchange for money. However, today, when you say Cuban, it carries a different type of presence. And it goes beyond the sentiment of the times. It's just simply that Cubans have lost their reputation as hard-working communities and more looked at as people willing to sell their values in order to have economical benefits. With Cubans who've been in the United States for longer seriously wanting to distance themselves from new Cuban arrivals. And while most Latin American communities all embrace each other, a lot of Latin American communities in the United States no longer want to embrace Cubans. Faster than any other generation, Cuban Americans born in the United States quickly lose the Spanish language, quickly forget their Cuban roots. They're also quicker to intermarry with other races or nationalities, quickly losing their Cuban identity. Even Afro-Cubans that are reaching the United States now are siding with other Latin American communities like Dominicans and Puerto Ricans and not joining Cuban American communities that were already established. And well, we can say that the Cuban community of the United States today is as divided as the Cuban American community of the Civil War era. The cuisine, the music, and the culture of Cuban Americans is being infusioned throughout the United States and is still very relevant, whether through musicians, athletes, or politicians. Cubans continue to be a strong cultural and influencing factor in everything that happens in the United States. Today, Cubans are not just simply moving to the United States. Cuban communities have started to pop up in Finland, Mexico, Canada, and over 170,000 Cubans now reside in Spain. Not being able to be in our home country, also not being welcomed in the United States, many Cubans have chosen to move to Spain, where their original heritage comes from. Initially, when Cubans came to the United States, they understood that someday they would return to Cuba. However, we've seen now, with decade after decade of no changes in Cuba, that many Cuban Americans, the 2 million that are in the United States, are likely here to stay. Key West, Florida is only 90 miles from Cuba. In theory, you could drive your car onto a ferry in Key West and drive it off in Havana in a matter of 2.5 hours. Despite the fact it's so close to the United States geographically, Cuba is now one of the most economically deprived countries in the world. If you live in Florida, most likely you're closer to the capital of Cuba than you are to the capital of Florida. Despite Cuba being geographically so close, it's almost impossible to go there. Cuba used to be one of the safest countries to travel for tourists despite the poverty. However, in recent years, an increase in crimes, those similar to what's taking place in Mexico, have definitely scared the crap out of tourists wanting to go to Cuba. In the meantime, Florida continues to be the home of nearly 1 million Cubans. And at this point, many Cuban Americans don't speak Spanish, may carry a Cuban last name, but really are more American than anything else. And that is the story of Cuban Americans in the United States.